Hi, Alex. Welcome to the Karma Summit. Thank you so much for taking out the time. We are deeply honored and privileged to have you join us.
Well, I thank you for the invitation. I feel quite honored to be a part of this summit, knowing the discussions that you've been having and some of the guests that you've been having. It's cool to be a part of it, and I'm actually quite impressed with what you've been able to accomplish in terms of bringing all these folks together. I think it's quite a lot of value that you're bringing to the participants.
Great. Thank you, Alex. And Alex, Global Giving has been, a leader working with nonprofits over the last couple of years, and you are amongst the largest and the most reputed in this space. Uh, the COVID situation has, disrupted uh, operations, fundraising, and a lot of other things for nonprofits across the globe. Uh, would love to understand from you, uh, what have you seen in your work at Global Giving uh, from a nonprofit perspective? What has changed? What remains the same? And how will the you know nature of programs and grants change in this post-COVID era? So, would love to understand your analysis and insights on the post-COVID era from a nonprofit perspective.
Well, thanks for the question. And again, thanks for the chance to talk about this. Um, Obviously, the COVID era, the oncoming of this pandemic has had an effect on literally every person on this planet. It has this unprecedented nature. And it's been the news story. So we've been thinking about it continuously, all of us. And so some of what we have seen, I think, is common to everybody, but I can highlight a few trends that may be helpful and also bring out some of the implications that we've felt as a funder and as a direct partner to nonprofits. So one of the aspects of this pandemic that has been so salient to me personally and to us as an organization is its differential impact on people and organizations depending on who we are, where we live, and what we have. As some folks have said, we are all susceptible to this wave, but some of us have bigger boats. And the difference in the impact, depending on the kind of boat you have, it has really been staggering. And so for us as a funder, what that has meant is that as we look out across our nonprofit partners, well, here's one thing that stands out. We tend to work with nonprofits that tend to be quite small. And so the impact of this in terms of their operations, the disruption of funding has been huge and disproportionately so. And so it has redoubled the importance that we have felt. And actually, I've noticed a lot of our funding partners, it's redoubled their focus on the most vulnerable organizations. So that's, I think, highlight number one, which is an imperative for funders to focus on those organizations that are least equipped, most vulnerable. I think that there's a second close parallel, which is focusing on those organizations that serve the most vulnerable populations, right? And so these are, folks without homes, folks in low income, any marginalized population is just at greater risk due to the pandemic. So also an imperative to do that. And then thirdly, I would say, so if there's a focus on who are we funding and what kinds of projects are we funding, there's also an imperative to focus on how we're doing the funding. And that is to make sure that in doing our funding and in the relationships that we build, that we are not inadvertently exacerbating the problem. So an example of that is that because of everything that's happened, the capacity of our nonprofit partners is put upon to an extreme level. So it's important for us in our attempts to alleviate this, not to exacerbate it. We experimented with a microgrant program, initially setting aside $100,000, where what we said was we went out to our nonprofit community and said, look, we know that you're hurting, just write us an email, no more than 3 sentences. Tell us what your needs are, and you'll be immediately eligible for a grant of $1,000. The end, right? That's the end of the requirement. Understandably, that was a huge success. We've actually been able to build on that and turn it into a program of about $500,000 to $500,000. And I think that program design is illustrative of the kind of response that funders need to have.
Got it. Yeah, I think very interesting points in terms of both the marginalized communities as well as the marginalized or most vulnerable nonprofits working in those communities, and the need to provide immediate relief to the nonprofits as much as the community. So
with as few strings as possible.
Got it. Yeah, you don't want them. They're already stretched, and you don't want them to be stretched further just purely to access grants, because they might just die in the process. So completely understand, and especially what you mentioned is the smaller nonprofits, and people mention that COVID is something which has impacted the entire humanity. So no one is spared to an extent, but as you mentioned, the degree is much higher for the most vulnerable, because it's just not the health risk, but also the economic risk, the livelihood risk, and a lot of other things which come along with it.
Yeah, absolutely. So on the one side is this shared vulnerability that we have through our shared biology, right? To all of us. But the other is the differential impact, and you see it in the numbers, you see it in the infection rates and the death rates. And so it seems very important to recognize that and to take advantage. If you're in a position of greater power, then do more of the work, and put less of a burden on those organizations and people that are more affected.
Yeah, and also the second order effects. For example, let's say there is a class of students who are out of school but who could switch over to Zoom for their education, but there is a class of students who had no access to laptops or internet, and they are just completely out of school. So the differential impact is huge, especially for the vulnerable sections.
That's exactly right. So whatever gap existed, it's only magnified by a huge amount. Exactly what you said. That small dynamic where I have 2 daughters, we have connectivity and hardware in this house, and it's not a problem for them to connect, right? So it's seamless for us, but it is such a disruption if you don't have the hardware and the connectivity and the expense of high bandwidth video supporting internet provider. So yes, absolutely.
Yep. And also going further to your point on global giving's intervention. So in response to the COVID pandemic, as well as the racial justice movement, which is also almost like a social pandemic. So would be good to understand your initiatives, what has worked, what has not worked, what do you want to build and scale upon in response to these crises.
Yes, there's a lot for all of us to think through, and so the intense focus on racial justice that was sparked by the killing of George Floyd and other events, but not just the events of May and June of 2020, right? But in fact, the entire history have been a large topic of discussion for us at Global Giving, and we're in an interesting position, and I won't be. I feel empowered to say that we've gotten some things right and some things we got wrong and some things we're still working on. It's an interesting position because as a largely white staff, here in Washington, D.C., but also led by a Black leader, for the first time, we've been having a conversation about what this means actually for us first. So in fact, what it led us to do is take a moment of introspection and identify that just internally for us, there are some things that we can do better internally. And that's true, again, even though we have a relatively diverse board and even though we have a Black CEO, those markers don't mean that you've got the problem solved. There's still work for you to do. And so we gave ourselves permission to do that and work on our own internal bias. So we had some of an internal response, which we're still continue to work on, and I think that this will be a work stream that goes forward. I feel actually eager to take it forward. And also, we naturally, again, turned to our partners, and that response came in two ways. One is we have nonprofit partners who have been doing amazing work this whole time on racial justice. And it seemed critical to us to live up to our promise to being a platform for those focused partners. Just really amazing organizations. I sent out, an email where I talked about some of my own experience, but then also the work of these partners out to our staff and our donors. And then sort of thirdly, after the initial internal focus, the attempts to lift up those partners who are doing the hard work on racial justice, actually realized that we have an amazing ability to serve as a platform for project leaders from around the world. We're a global community. Yes. We're active in 170 countries. So we have projects and project leaders, amazing social change agents of every color, of every race, certainly many incredible Black leaders of amazing projects. And so, really independent of the subject of their projects, if they're working on disaster relief, if they're working on health, if they're working on arts or education, some of these leaders are also, just by virtue of their identity, engaged in the struggle for racial justice. And so it's also been a call to us to do even better at highlighting those project leaders.
Got it. Yeah, and I think, as you rightly mentioned, that it's not 2020's problem in that way on the racial justice part. It's just that it, catalyzed in this year. But I think it's also a unique time for us to rebuild our communities and, to do it in the right way, ensuring justice, ensuring sustainability, ensuring access, and the right use of technology. So would love to understand from that perspective that, from a nonprofit lens, are there any emerging areas or opportunities which nonprofits can focus on, given what is happening in the overall context today?
I think so. And, stepping back, just thinking about lessons of strategy and sort of strategic thinking, any period of change, right? Any dynamic period. And, it's hard to think of a period that's more dynamic than right now, that's full of uncertainty, is invitation to do strategic thinking, right? Things are changing, the context is changing, and so therefore necessarily the way of operating needs to change. And I think that it's a responsibility that the leader of any organization has to try to see through the current context to what's coming next. And so, with that in mind, and with a nonprofit lens specifically, I can share some of what we've heard from our nonprofits and some of what we've observed as being indicators of a more successful strategy. So one sort of area of focus that we continuously have and that we're always interested in is the orientation of our nonprofit partners to be community-led. And that phrase can have a lot of different incarnations, okay? But at its base level, to be community-led means to be oriented towards serving your community and oriented towards listening and gathering feedback from your community. And so that may be the community of people actually that you're serving, your quote unquote beneficiaries as
Yeah.
a nonprofit
Mm-hmm.
organization. And what we've seen over the last few months is that those of our partners that have been more oriented towards the needs of their communities have experienced at least two positive impacts or positive implications. One is that those organizations were among the first to understand how they had to pivot their operating model to be relevant and impactful as the way that the world works changed, okay? Because it just required all of us to operate in new ways, and to the extent that those organizations had more direct and more pre-existing lines of feedback from their community serve, they changed the way that they worked. They changed in terms of whether or not they had to go virtual or not, just different ways of communicating, reaching out by phone, etc. So that's one thing. And also another dimension of being community led has to do with having a base of support, including financial support locally, which can be difficult. But again, and some of this is intuitive, if you think about it, those organizations that had a base of support that was community-based, or to a degree that it was more community-based, found themselves a bit protected from some of the shifts in giving that occurred, right? As coronavirus and COVID kind of took all the attention, found themselves a bit protected and still able to draw on some support. And so that's one of the, that kind of resilience is one of the trends that I think is instructive for organizations as they think about how to respond.
Got it. Yeah, it's very interesting. When you mentioned community led, being an entrepreneur, what it meant for me was, it's like listening to your customers, because community is your customer in a way, and also an investor in a way. So it's almost listening to to your stakeholders, and because that is what will help you navigate, adopt, and evolve towards more success. So really important point there.
And so I think that's exactly right. For sort of a for-profit venture, it seems more natural. Sometimes in a nonprofit there can be some mixed signals and cross signals, including from funding. So I might even draw a link back to what I was talking about before in terms of what we see our role as a funder. We believe that it's important for us not to create a sort of contrary signal as a funder to demand, kind of attention to our needs, but rather to preserve the ability of our partners to really focus on the communities that they're serving as the true customer, right? As the true stakeholder. And in fact, our stakeholder as well, even if indirectly. But yes, I agree.
Yeah, got it. You also mentioned that the COVID crisis meant that a lot of funding was going towards relief, which meant there is an entire set of nonprofits which were operating in different other programmatic areas where the funding might dry up. And community led can be one kind of an insurance that ways. But what is your advice to nonprofits, and especially small nonprofits, as to what are the three things that a leader of a small nonprofit should think about doing today, giving both the risk and the opportunities in front of them?
Okay, I'll try to distill it to three. The first, as a direct response to this challenge of fundraising, is that it's true that amazing amounts of funding have gone to COVID relief, which for us, being able to see some of this has been really a source of inspiration, right? It's the best of humanity, I think, when
Mm-hmm.
we respond through generosity
Mm-hmm.
to a tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I will also say is that as we've looked at the donations that are going through our platform, and again, the donations sort of come
Yep.
through us, right, to
Yeah.
our partners,
Mm-hmm.
what we have seen is a huge amount of, I mean, really, I don't want to understate it, an unprecedented amount of giving in response to coronavirus. But
Mm-hmm.
actually, if you subtract that out,
Mm-hmm.
still some moderate growth in other giving.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
And so that's, I think, a quite hopeful story. We
Yeah.
have not seen
Mm-hmm.
the COVID related giving cannibalize the other giving.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, that's really thrilling for us to see,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's quite energizing. And I think that there are some lessons, because what we've seen
Mm-hmm.
is that every organization
Mm-hmm.
has a COVID story, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And it's important, and so here's the kind of advice.
Mm-hmm.
It's important to be ready to be upfront and share that story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If you are an arts program,
Mm-hmm.
there is a truth about how this pandemic has affected you
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that you need to tell in order to support the critical work that you're doing, because actually the arts program that you're doing is part of the response.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's
Yeah.
part of keeping the economy going, or it's part of, providing a structure for kids,
Mm-hmm.
or whatever it is,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Everybody's work,
Mm-hmm.
not only is everybody affected by this pandemic, but your work is part of the response. And so telling that story is important, and not counting yourself out. And
Got it.
that's what we've seen on the part of our partners, and something that we've strived to help them do, which is to tell that story.
Mm-hmm.
And what I can say is that, at least from our data set, we see that that has had an impact,
Yeah.
because we've not seen the giving shrink. So that's one that I would say. And then the other two things, I would abstract out to really any leader, whether you're a nonprofit or not,
Mm-hmm.
which is to basically not to pretend that the context hasn't changed.
Mm-hmm.
Everything in our operating environment is different, and so therefore, if the inputs are different, the outputs have to be different.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think certainly I felt the temptation early on to just try to keep things moving, right? Try to keep the engine going, try to keep the train running. But in fact, that's a false hope. And so I think the quicker you can make sure that you're dispensing with that function, the better.
Mm-hmm.
And another, the last thing that I'll say, as a leader on this list, is to make sure that the needs of your staff are at the top, because it would be a big miss to not acknowledge that, in fact, every member of your staff is being impacted on a personal level, whether directly through the impact of the sickness, or just through the fact that there's no childcare, and there's no school, and there's no public transportation, and there's no way to exercise, and so certainly what we've tried to do is continually focus on that as a leadership team, which is the needs of our individual staff members.
Great. I think really great points. And the first one was, every organization has a COVID story, and that's true, because every domain as such is impacted by COVID, and everyone is helping in some domain, so there is a COVID story everywhere, and everyone has to pivot or disrupt in a way, because inputs are changing, so you need to change the way to work and the outputs. And also, staff and your team is probably the most critical thing, so it's important to take care of them. Great points. Wanted to also understand that a lot of US nonprofits and also across the world work with volunteers quite a lot, and they do a lot of the heavy lifting, and because of the COVID crisis, that has taken a huge hit. So there are new ways like virtual volunteering which has come up, but would love to get your thoughts on what is the new normal around volunteering, is that something which nonprofits can leverage or not moving forward?
Yes. I think we were talking a little bit before about strategy and the need for strategic thinking in an environment that is fast moving.
Mm-hmm.
I won't pretend to have the read on this, in part because I'm not smart enough to have the read on it, but also because I think this is one of those aspects of the environment that is still very much in flux and very much changing.
Mm-hmm.
One of the, I used to be a classroom teacher. And so I think about different modalities and how, for my kids, for example, the school has been put virtual and what that means. And I think that there's one part of this which I find really interesting, which is the forced technological training that we're all undergoing. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So every teacher
Mm-hmm.
has now been trained sort of, through in a crucible, right, through fire, with video conferencing, preparing materials online, chat and different, communications. Same with every student, right? Every student has been given this training, and that's true, obviously, of all of us. I mean, some of us as knowledge workers have been more facile with it, but the sort of depth of the exposure has really gone quite far. And so what that means is, and it's continuing to happen, even were things to switch back immediately, and there's a vaccine, and the trains are running and offices are open. This is an aspect that is now different. That everybody is much more facile, and to me, I think that this is something that it's important not to underestimate. And so what that means is that there's a new opportunity to take advantage of new modalities, but those new modalities, and here's where some of my thinking as a teacher come into play, require deliberate work. So for example, as an internal team, we did a team building exercise. I don't know if you know what an escape room is, where you go in and there are sort of clues and you have to solve it. So we actually did a virtual escape room, just as a team building exercise. And you might think, well, that's impossible to do because it requires going through physical clues. And I won't go into all the details of how that happened, but suffice to say, the provider did an incredible amount of work. They had a guy there with a GoPro that was streaming. They had an online system to track the clues that we could share. They had a split screen, right? So it wasn't just turn on Zoom and try to do it. And the reason I'm telling that story, to get back to volunteering, is I think that is what the call is. So again, I don't exactly have the solution to what volunteering is going to look like, but I do know that it's a major opportunity. It's a major opportunity because our population globally just has been upskilled in all sorts of communications and connection technology. So be ready for that. And I know that any translated experience, like whether it's this escape room or whether it's just teaching in class, actually requires new materials. It requires a new platform. You can't just turn on Zoom and have it work. You have to think deliberately, almost like a lesson plan, about what is the support. In teaching, we call it scaffolding. What is the scaffolding that you provide for that volunteer so that they're going to be successful and then make the connection? But when you do that, I think a magic can happen. So again, I wish I had the answer for how to do it. I'm curious, and we're talking to our nonprofit partners about it. But I feel quite optimistic that there's a lot of potential here.
Yep. And I think what technology brings in is more access. It makes it borderless. It makes it cost effective. It makes it scalable, and saves time. So it can be game changing if done in the right way.
I think this is one of those dynamics that's happening in the midst of a tragedy, but it's strategically it's really interesting to think about exactly these technologies that are now. And by the way, it's not just people, but obviously there's pressure on the improvement of these technologies now, right? There's market pressure.
Yeah.
So we're going to come out of this, you know, in a different state with respect to these borderless, you know, hopefully frictionless, you know, ways of creating human connection virtually. So that part of it is quite exciting to think about.
All right. So one last question, you know, before we leave, and you know, we at Godera believe that you know, rebuilding has to be a people's movement, and you know, everyone has to get involved, and that's when it helps the community, but it also helps each and every one of us, especially in this, you know, state where there is a lot of mental well-being and other aspects as well. So you know, if you were to think of, you know, 3 words on volunteering, what would those 3 words be?
That's a great question. I'll try to condense it down. So with respect to volunteering, one is goodwill, in that it really captures, again, the best of humanity and this goodwill that we're able to generate. So that's one. The second is privilege, because certainly I feel this when I am a volunteer, and I see it on behalf of the volunteers that I observe. It's a privilege to be able to contribute to life-changing work. And then the third is a connection, and maybe that goes back to what we were just talking about, that every volunteer opportunity is an opportunity for human-to-human connection. Yeah, and you know, if there's not value in that, I think that that's actually one of the, you know, greatest sources of value, that human-to-human connection.
No, those are, you know, actually true gems. Those are great words, and you know, thank you so much for joining the, you know, panel and the session at the Karma Summit. You know, really grateful, and you know, look forward to you know, long-standing relationship and partnership with Global Giving. Thank you so much.
Well, I agree. Let me return that, Abhishek. It's been a privilege to be a part of this conversation. And again, thank you for letting me be a part, and congratulations on this incredible conversation that you're facilitating. I'm so eager to see what the other conversations have been about. You're contributing a lot to the sector.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Alex.